set myself out here.
Okay.
I said I'm teaching not just Pentateuch, but I'm trying to teach. I told you guys that I'm not only teaching Pentateuch, but I'm also trying to teach you guys life skills and some other things. I want to take just a minute or two and ask you guys, how many of you, aside from studying for class, how many of you are actually doing either home devotionals or studying on your own? Okay, most of you. Very good. Let me encourage you, do this for me. Especially if you're married, if you have children, start now studying the Bible every single morning or every single night. Even if it's 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever it is. It's something that I wish I had started earlier. It is something that has really transformed not only my depth of knowledge, but it's actually changed my family, our dynamics. And you know, if there's something that I could teach you guys outside of the Pentateuch, it would be in ensuring to get your family to heaven. One of the ways that you need to do that is to actively do something in the home focused around God's Word. We don't do that enough in the church, and I suspect one of the things that you're going to be beating your head against the wall as a preacher is trying to get the congregation that you're teaching to try to get them to actually study the Bible outside of the four walls of your building. And I think one of the ways in which you guys can have the biggest impact is if they see your family doing that. You all will get to meet my family before the quarter is over. I'm not telling you when, but I'll just say we're coming. I have 4 children, all under the age of 10. And usually every single night we will take at least 10, 15, 20 minutes, and we call it, for lack of better terms, we call it Bible time. It varies from day to day. Sometimes we're actually studying for maybe a Bible bowl. Sometimes if you ask the Wilkie family what Bible Showdown is, they will tell you. We have a Nerf gun at my house that Dad gets to use and shoot my children when they miss Bible questions. In all seriousness, guys, let me tell you, if you can employ something in your home now to get good study habits with yourself and with your mate and with your children, it's going to greatly affect your marriage. It's going to greatly affect your family. So mark that down as Brad Harrub's life lesson number 1. Actually, that's number 2. Somebody have a question? Yeah.
The email you gave us, it's different than the one you gave us the other day. The first
Yes.
one was Brad H.
Okay.
The one you was just Brad.
Yes. Brad H. Is the one that actually comes directly to me. It is my private email, and you can send it to that one too. That's fine. Either one of them is fine. Brad at Focus Press, they actually get looked at by my assistant first, and then she forwards them on to me. So either email is fine, Brad at focuspress.org or Brad H at focuspress.org. If you're ever communicating with me personally about, something confidential or personal, use the one that has my first initial, my last name, Brad H. Other comments, questions? Okay, on last Thursday, you guys watched the DVD, the first of which spent hopefully a great deal of time looking at things like the vast old ages of the patriarchs, talked quite a bit about the flood, talked about the origin of races. I want to pick up a little bit there that was not mentioned in that particular DVD. That DVD's a few years older. But before I do that, are there any hanging questions, things that maybe you guys are thinking, man, I wish I'd have been able to ask him X, Y, or Z? Let me refresh your memory. Yeah, go ahead, Keely.
I had a question about the melanin gene. So,
yes.
Would everybody up to, the time of Noah had every melanin gene, or if I have 4 children, are they all going to have all of David and my melanin genes, or do they get specific ones?
Okay, let's kind of review that. In your body right now, you have melanocyte cells. The amount of melanin is a chemical that determines how dark your skin is going to be. The amount of melanin that's in each one of those cells is determined from your parents. Okay. And so you remember we put up a little chart on the screen that actually showed kind of all kind of variations. If your 2 parents have a mixture of melanin, and by that I would say they were probably kind of a mocha color. So if you and your husband were both mocha color, that means your children are going to be able to get a variation of colors through that combination.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Other comments, questions? Oh, you guys are quiet. That's good. Let's pick up with the flood, some material that was not covered on the DVD. One of the things that I want to make sure you guys understand about it is the flood itself more than likely kicked off the Ice Age. Everybody in here studied, history classes where you learn about a land bridge that connects Alaska to Asia. And we know about this time period where supposedly woolly mammoths roam the earth. We have saber-toothed tigers. The problem that we have in the Ice Age as far as in the secular world is they would teach our children that this happened millions or hundreds of thousands of years ago. A better question would be, what does it take to make an Ice Age, and do we see anything like that in the past, specifically in the biblical record? In order to get, first off, I guess the question we need to ask is, was there an Ice Age? The answer is absolutely yes, there was. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we know that there was an Ice Age. One of the reasons that I can say that with such confidence is because we know when the glaciers were coming down, unlike a river would carve a V-shaped valley. Those glaciers actually carve out a U-shaped valley. And they would take with them rocks and boulders and sand. And as those glaciers pushed forward, all of that material, the rocks, the sand, the boulders, they got pushed into that leading edge. And when those glaciers finally melted, they left what we oftentimes refer to as till mounds in the shape of a horseshoe. You can go up to Alaska today, you can see glaciers. I mean, it's anybody that says there was not an Ice Age is completely ignoring the evidence. Now, how does it fit in to the Bible? If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. God here is telling us where the water is coming from for the flood. He says, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broke up, and the windows of heaven were open. Now, we've already talked about the windows of heaven probably being a biblical indication of some kind of maybe an ice canopy or water vapor canopy around the earth. What I want to focus on, though, is what it's talking about with those fountains of the great deep breaking up. Guys, anytime you see in the text things breaking up at the hand of God, that tells you it's going to be a pretty serious action, and we're going to be tearing apart tectonic plates. Now, ask yourself from your old history lessons, as you go deeper in the earth towards the mantle, do you get hotter or colder?
Hotter.
You get hotter. Remember, that's where the lava is. So you've got things that are tearing apart in the great deep. Guys, do you realize that is an indication that there are going to be volcanoes going off literally all over the place? Now, we know Mount St. Helens, when it erupted, it blew ash 4 states away. But I want you to imagine, as you're sitting there, I want you to imagine volcanoes going off on the land and in the water simultaneously all across the planet. What you have got at that moment is the perfect recipe for an ice age. Because what you need in order to have an ice age, number one, you've got to have increased evaporation. How do you get increased evaporation? You warm up the oceans with that lava. The fountains of the great deep were broke up. But here's the tricky part. At the same time that you increase evaporation, you've also got to cool off the land. How do you do that? With the ash. The ash from those volcanoes. So you've got volcanoes going off, ash billowing up, blocking out the sun's rays. Oceans are being warmed from the lava. Essentially, what you've got is the perfect recipe for an ice age that we think lasted somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 to 500 years post-flood. So as you're looking at everything that's going on in history, you remember our little timeline we threw up there, and we said, okay, we got 1,500 years to the flood. Then we've got roughly, in round numbers, another 500 years to Abraham. Do you realize that second 500 years, the Ice Age was still in effect? You want to talk about how people were dispersed after the Tower of Babel? Or how the animals were dispersed after the flood? There's your answer, guys. They could have literally walked from Africa, Europe, Asia, across that land bridge into North America, South America. In fact, I would argue that that's how the original Native Americans, the Aztecs, the Mayans, how they got here was through that particular time period. The ice bridge then melted, leaving them landlocked, and lo and behold, look what we've got today. Chris.
So, trying to write this down, I missed the part. Did you say that then during the Tower of Babel was a possibility that we were still in the Ice Age?
Absolutely. Yes. In fact, if you look at Genesis chapter 11, picking up in verse, I'm going to pick up in verse 6. The Lord said, indeed the people are one. They have one language. And this is what they will begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. Notice verse 8. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. So if you really want to know when all of these peoples began, as far as all the different nations, there's your answer right there. Other comments, questions, thoughts? Wow, you guys are quiet. That's, in a way, that's kind of good because we got to cover a lot of ground today. Tower of Babel, very, very important part of our history. Up to that point, we had a universal language. Ironically, scientifically speaking, man, they recognize the fact that man has a universal language or is anatomically built to understand language universally. I want us to drop back. We're going to start in, everybody go ahead and open your Bible up to Genesis chapter 8. And let's start with a question that somebody sent me. And I apologize, I don't have my computer in front of me. I will get it when we stop for the break. But somebody asked me the question, they said, hey, what about clean and non-clean animals for the flood? What do you guys think? Why was there a designation between clean and unclean? Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I mean, obviously there were some animals that we weren't going to need to eat because our bodies weren't prepared to eat. And maybe, the Bible speaks that beforehand, and we've already talked about it, that we were vegetarian. So
right.
Obviously to eat some of those animals possibly would make us sick. Some of them probably as well needed to be food for other animals. after the ark settled, I can imagine that there wasn't lush vegetation. What were a lot of the animals going to eat, as well as us? And then maybe many of the animals as well were going to be used for sacrifice.
Okay, first and foremost, where is the very first scriptural reference we have to men eating animals? It's post-flood, Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. So if you're looking at this thing from a scriptural standpoint, we have no biblical reference of men eating meat prior to the flood. But were they already worshiping God? Yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. How do we know that? Who are the two people that offered something to God?
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. So apparently God had already addressed a worship style or what was acceptable to him. We got clean animals, we got unclean animals. Why would we have clean? Because those are the ones that are clean, considered for worship. Okay? So why in the world would you take, for instance, 7 pair of the clean? A couple of reasons. Number one, after the flood, God does say, hey, okay, now you can eat meat. Number two, what's the first thing Noah does after he gets off the boat?
Sacrifice.
Right. He builds an altar for sacrificing. So does it make sense that these people already knew which animals were clean for sacrificing and that God wanted to take extra ones on board? Absolutely. Yes. I'm throwing this in there. You guys, this particular verse, you're getting this one for free. Genesis 8, verse 22. While earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter, summer, day and night shall not cease. If somebody in your congregation asks you about global warming, you can tell them absolutely there is going to be global warming when Jesus Christ comes back. Guys, this tells me very clearly that no matter what we can mess up the earth a lot, but ultimately the only thing that is going to destroy this earth is what?
Fire.
When Jesus Christ comes back. Okay? Now, we start getting into the promise of Noah. We've already talked about the fact that this is when God says, okay, you can eat meat. Ironically, this is the first part where we really start seeing a major significance with the idea of blood. That blood idea is going to run continuously from this point on all the way to the cross. What does the book of Deuteronomy say about blood?
Life of
And
the flesh.
Leviticus.
It's the life of the flesh.
Exactly. God put a rainbow in the sky, we know that, and we've talked about the fact that points to probably a pretty good, at least it's reasonable to conclude that there was not rain before the flood. Otherwise, that rainbow would not have meant as much to Noah. It wouldn't have been as important or as big a deal to him. So God makes a covenant with Noah. He says, look, as long as there are people on the earth, I'm not going to destroy the earth again with water. We talked already, I think, during the very first class about the fact that he also, at this point, decides he's no longer going to be cursing the ground. That's an important point. Because for the first 1,500 years of our history, sin accompanied God cursing the ground. That's no longer going to happen anymore. We then get into the family lineage of Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. And one of the things that we know Noah did was he planted a vineyard. I don't think that's a really big idea, as far as some people have said, wow, he's the first person to ever have drank wine or plant a vineyard. I don't think that's the case. I think, in the first 1,500 years of Earth's history, I think there were lots of people who knew what grapes were or who knew what various fruits were. Obviously, it says he drank wine in verse 21. he was drunk. He was uncovered in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, told his two brothers outside. Why do you think the Bible, on several different occasions, starting at this reference, specifically points out that Ham was the father of Canaan? Why is that a big deal?
Well, the Israelites were going to conquer Canaan later on.
Okay, that's true. What else? What cities? The Canaanites were composed of who? For instance, if you look in chapter 10 with me. Look at, starting at verse, let's see. You got the lineage of Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were. So then we go down and we start seeing names that really start standing out, as far as you've got the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. Let's see. Look in verse 19. The border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as far from Sidon as you go outward towards Gerar, as far from Gaza. Then you go towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah. These were people who eventually did what kind of behaviors?
Sexually immoral.
Immoral. Sexually immoral, to be specific. Guys, I don't think it is probably an accident that you have an occasion in the Bible where it's talking about Ham seeing the nakedness of his father, and then Moses repeatedly ties this guy to Canaan and to Sodom, to Gomorrah, to the cities of the plain that God is eventually going to destroy because of immorality and idolatry. Now, do we know specifically what Ham did to his dad? Absolutely not. We don't. Lots of speculation, lots of scholars out there. I'm going to share with you my opinion. We can disagree all day long, and it's not going to matter to our salvation one bit. I do know the text says that Noah recognized that something had happened to him when he woke up. I kind of think that is leaning towards a homosexual encounter from Ham. And I think that's probably why we continue to see this tying negative baggage onto Ham throughout the rest of the text. So we've got chapter 9. We've got the nations descended from Noah in chapter 10, where it specifically gives the three offspring. Now, I would point out that most of the Oriental nations, places like China, Japan, they trace their lineage back to Japheth. Who are we worried about, though?
Shem.
Who does Jesus come through?
David comes through Shem.
There you go, through Shem. So we've got Ham. Ham is leading the father of Canaan. He is basically establishing what we might call a bad group of folks. We've got Japheth, whose descendants will later on be recognized as folks from Asia, from China, from Korea, from Japan. Then we've got Shem, who is going to take us throughout the rest of this book. Tower of Babel happens in chapter 11. Do you think, were they actually punished for building a tower?
No.
No, what were they punished for?
The motives behind building the tower.
Okay. God had told them he wanted them to spread out. They didn't do that. They wanted to stay together and build this tower up. And basically it was a pride thing. They wanted to see what they could do. Any questions or comments all the way through chapter 12, up to chapter 12? At chapter 12, we take a very, very major, distinctive change in the text. For those of you who write in your Bibles, what I want you to do is put a big line or a big asterisk right between the end of Genesis chapter 11 and the beginning of 12. Because what we do is we go from a historical period of 1,500 years, basically given to us in just a few short chapters. Now we're going to zone in on a single figure for many, many chapters. Now think about that. All the way up through Genesis 6, where it starts the flood, you got 6 chapters of the Bible that cover 1,500 years. Now we're going to focus on Abraham for several more chapters than that, and yet we're just covering a scant few years. You realize, guys, Abraham is a key figure to the Muslim religion, to the Jewish religion, to the Christian religion. I mean, basically, when you look all across monotheistic religions, Abraham is one guy that we can all agree on. He's a very, very key player for the rest of the text. So we pick up with Abraham, Genesis chapter 12. Somebody tell me where physically he was.
Mesopotamia?
Mesopotamia. What specific city area do we refer to? Exactly. So, of the Chaldees, he's in Mesopotamia. He's apparently got a pretty good life. Now, I want to ask you, how many of you guys feel like Abraham? All of you should, and let me tell you why. Turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Listen very carefully to verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. How many of y'all know where you're going to be in 2 years? None of you, probably. I mean, some of you may be thinking, well, I hope I get to preach close to my home, or I hope I get to go back to Texas or to Florida or New Zealand or wherever. But realistically, guys, you've been called out. You don't even know where you're going to end up. So in a way, you're kind of like Abraham. He leaves Ur. Where does he go next? Before you answer that question, I want to make sure you understand who is with him. We know his wife, Sarah, is with him, right?
Right.
Who is the older person who is in this figure as well? His dad, Terah. You can check that out in chapter 11. Verse 31, Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and the daughter-in-law, Sarai, his son Abram's wife. So we've got this contingent of people. And there again, there's some discussion on whether or not Abraham, whether he left Ur willingly and said, okay, God, or whether he went with Terah, or whether there was kind of this divine plan. Long story short is, they all picked up, they left, they ended up in Canaan. God says what? He makes him 2 promises. What are the 2 promises?
He's going to make him a father of many nations.
Okay? So one of them is going to be, basically you can look at it this way, the 2 promises. One is a land promise, one is a seed promise. He says, look, you see all this? I'm going to give it to you. Number 2, I'm going to make your descendants multiply like the stars, like the sands, where you can't even count them. So on this first trip, as you're looking and you're reading in Genesis chapter 12, God is making his promise to Abraham. We find Abraham goes and looks at the land. In fact, if you look, and I'm not going to read all this, but I do want to make sure you guys understand what's happening in the text. Verses 5 and verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah. So we see him basically, he's kind of scoping out the promised land. But he doesn't stay. Why not? What happened?
Famine.
There was a famine in the land. Now, this is one of those things, you know, how you guys have probably got questions that you want to ask certain biblical people when you get up to heaven. You know, hey, Paul, what was this like? Or, hey, Noah, what was this like? This is one of those questions further down my list that I want to ask. Hey, Abraham, did you leave because you didn't think God could take care of the land? Or did you feel divinely pulled down to Egypt? Because, folks, if God is saying, I'm going to give you this land, do you not think that he can make the stuff grow? And yet he goes on down to Egypt. So right before he gets to Egypt, he turns to his wife. What does he say?
You're pretty. Be careful.
You're pretty, exactly. And how old did you guys learn that she probably was? She's pushing what?
75.
She's not exactly, you know, in congregations of the church, we have groups and programs for these group of people. You know, we got the seniors or the golden agers or the whatever. Sarah would have been in that group, according to her age. And yet, she still looks beautiful. They go down into Egypt. And what happens there? Somebody give me a scenario, in your own words, of what happens. Yeah, Keely.
Abraham tells her, tell everybody you're my sister because I'm afraid of the men. And so
Okay.
they get down there and she obeys him in that way. And the Pharaoh says, wow, you know, your sister's beautiful, and takes her into his home, and God curses him with plagues because
Okay.
she's not available.
Real quick question. Was Abraham wrong in doing that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was. I mean, there's some argument about, and you guys will learn a little bit later on in Genesis that they are half brother, half sister. But no matter what, there's the idea of deceit is involved. And even if you are half brother, half sister, there's still that deceit factor that you got to play into it. The plagues did rain down. Pharaoh says, hey, man, what are you trying to do here? Now, it's ironic, and I want to make sure you guys don't miss this. Do you realize Pharaoh put more emphasis on marriage at that point than Abraham did? Because Pharaoh returned Sarah to her husband. And yet Abraham had basically been willing to say, you know what, girl, hey, as long as it keeps me alive, you just go do what you need to do. Pharaoh, and this is sad, but there are times where, folks, unbelievers and non-Christians actually show more faith than Christians do. And I think that's part of what happened here. All right, they leave. What happens at that point? They go north again. So in your mind, I want you to imagine that Fertile Crescent. You got Abraham leaving Ur. He goes to Canaan. He looks around at the land that God is promising. A famine hits. He heads south to Egypt. Egypt being the land allegedly of plenty. All of a sudden, they decide they need to get out of town. Why did they leave?
Leave Egypt?
Yeah.
Well, it says they sent him away, verse 20.
So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Pharaoh didn't want this guy around. So it wasn't like Abraham had a choice. So he heads back to Canaan, and that's where he inherits the land. What do we know real quickly regarding when they get there? We have a scene between Abraham and Lot. What happens?
They became prosperous. They had so much cattle, so much property, if you will. They need to separate.
And Abraham lets Lot decide. Lot says what?
I'm going over here towards the city.
He basically looks at the land and says, okay, this is green and pretty. I'll take that, and you can have the, it kind of be like the hogback area of Denver. You can have the dirt-covered stuff over there. So they split up. Everything is going fairly well, and we keep focusing. Now realize, not much time has passed. And all of a sudden, we have an incident with Melchizedek. Somebody tell me what this is all about. If you're in your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Genesis 14, because I want you to kind of stay with me. We're going to cruise. We're going to try to get almost all the way done with Genesis today. I know. What happens with Melchizedek right here?
Does he bless Abraham?
Why?
Because he is, I don't know the word, but he's greater than Abraham?
Okay, so we've got Melchizedek actually coming out and blessing him. That's going to be important as we go through this whole deal. We see now that we've got this one person who is going to get us from Abraham to Christ. Or I guess I should say from Adam to Christ. But Abraham is kind of that key figure now that's we're going to zoom in on his lineage. Again, chapter 15, God is making his covenant with him. Somebody tell me what the word Isaac means in the original text. In Hebrew, what does Isaac mean?
Laughter.
Laughter. Why do you think they named him Laughter? You think I'm going to have a child in my old age? So we pick up in chapter 16 with them having a plan. Now, guys, anytime you try to get around God's original plan, this is a great example, and it's a great teaching and preaching example of what happens when mankind tries to do things our way. God tells Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a child. Your descendants are going to multiply. She looks, she's barren. She says, you know what? I want you to take Hagar, my handmaid, and have sexual relations with her. And we know Ishmael resulted from that. Now, I would point out to you, it looks like probably Hagar was an Egyptian handmaid, so probably when they go down with this famine, Sarah gets a handmaid named Hagar. They travel back up to Canaan. Hagar travels with them, and that's where we find this particular account going on. Somebody tell me what eventually happens with Ishmael and Hagar.
They're kicked out because of jealousy between her and Sarah, and so they're excommunicated from the family.
Bingo. So basically, when Isaac comes on the scene, Sarah says, I ain't having her around anymore. Now, you know, a lot of times people will ask you questions about things like, what about, Brad, surrogate parenting? Or what about, Brad, in vitro fertilization? Or what about artificial insemination? Or what about... Guys, one of the points that you need to keep in mind is just because technology allows us to do something does not make it right. There is a marriage bed that should not be defiled. Now, do I, as a scientist and a Christian, have a problem with a husband and a wife using technology, trying to get pregnant? Absolutely not, as long as it doesn't destroy life or involve people outside of that marriage bed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You guys will get asked the question, if you are in a congregation of 200, 300, there are going to be people that come and they sit in your office, they look you in the eye with tears coming down their face saying, we are having trouble getting pregnant. Can we have in vitro fertilization? What you need to do is you need to, number one, step by step approach them as far as when does God view life begin? Conception. Number two, you need to ask them, in that IVF procedure, does it ever involve the destruction of those leftover embryos, or what happens to all those embryos? It's not going to be a fun counseling session. It's not something that you're going to want to do, and it's probably going to be something that everybody leaves crying from. But the truth of the matter is, guys, in the real world, what they usually do is they take 15 to 18 eggs, they fertilize all of them, they implant 3. That leaves a whole lot of leftovers that are either later on destroyed, or maybe in some cases 3 more are eventually planted in to try to have a second child. Either way, you're still destroying usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 fertilized embryos. So God's got a plan. We need to stick to the plan. Questions, comments before we move on to chapter 18? You guys are quiet today. They must be loading you down in those other classes.
They are.
Chris.
What about on some of the birth control methods that are out there that apparently once the, you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. How is it that Bear Valley always gets me on this one topic? I did a chapel last year on this very topic, and I'll say this, guys. I'm not going to go into great detail about it right now just because of time, but we will, as a group, we'll talk about it together at some point. Here's what you need to know, both from a personal perspective and from a preacher giving advice perspective, and that is Christians can never, ever support something that is post-conception birth control. And by that I mean, for instance, an IUD, intrauterine device, is a post-conception device. What it does is, after that sperm and egg have come together, they create an embryo, floats down, and that device itself actually is going to kill or destroy, make inhabitable the environment for that particular embryo to implant. So can a Christian support anything that is post-conception? No. Furthermore, and this is just me preaching, Chris, since you asked, I think it's time that we start thinking about why we're doing what we're doing. I think my generation, especially, we grew up with the idea that 2 kids is normal, and then you basically try to limit your family to that size. We don't view children as a blessing, as the psalmist said in Psalm 127. I think it's time we kind of reevaluate what our perspective is on children and what God's desire would be. Okay? We'll talk more about that, I promise, guys. In fact, they will probably pester me to maybe do another chapel or something like medical ethics when I come down and see you guys in person.
Brad, backing up just a moment before you move forward.
Yes.
The ideal of a single person wanting to have a child by, was it IVU? Is that the proper phrase?
Yeah, well, in vitro fertilization.
Yes.
Okay.
A single individual. What are your thoughts on that?
Is that God's plan?
I think it's supposed to be husband and wife.
I read in Genesis chapter 2, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Then I flip over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, where Paul, talking to the young widows, said, I desire that young women marry, bear children, and guide the house. So you got a divinely laid down order that first we're to get married, something our society needs to be reminded of. Then we have children. Then we guide the house.
What if she wants to adopt? Same thing?
What if who wants to adopt? A woman?
Single mother, yes. Single person.
Okay, there's a difference in a single mother and just a single person.
Just a single
But again,
woman.
But again, understand, God has got a plan, and the plan is for a family unit. And for us to come in and say, oh man, you know, that single person would make a great mom. Well, they may. In fact, they may be a really good person, but that's outside of his plan. Comments, thoughts, questions?
It'd be tough to be a great mom and a great dad at the same time. God
Yeah,
doesn't
and
think it's necessary.
guys, you know, I'm not a professional parent. I only have 4 children. But I do know this. I do know that mommies and daddies are dramatically different. And I know that healthy children need both. I know that when we go to the beach and my children want somebody to, for instance, put suntan lotion on them, they want mommy because they know daddy will basically not care if they got sand and it will scratch the skin off their back and not really care. But they know if they want to go play in the waves that daddy's funner than mommy. And I know that there's a healthy balance that children receive by having both a mom and a dad. We'll touch on some of this as we continue through, especially as we're getting into some of the laws in Leviticus. And yeah.
I know it's just a matter of opinion, but what do you think about remarriage after the age of widow?
Oh, goodness. I thought you were going the whole marriage, divorce, remarriage thing. I thought, let's just throw all the controversy out on the table. I mean, after all, we only got to get through 40 more chapters of Genesis. That's good. What do I think as far as widows remarrying? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Believe it or not, I think this one's pretty easy. I think that the text is very clear that they need to marry in the Lord. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think from what I have seen as a preacher / as a person in some really bad situations as far as from the medical side, I think it's very wise for older people to wait at least a year. That's just a Brad Harrub opinion. You know, I would recommend older people waiting a year before they make any major decision about moving, about getting remarried, about doing anything big, to kind of allow themselves the time to actually grieve and to get over what they need to get over. But I think there again, there's nothing more important in this world than getting to heaven. And so if there's ever any question, doubt, concern, issue, all of that pales to getting to heaven. So if somebody sits with me and says, Brad, I'm thinking about getting remarried. My spouse has died. Well, I know that death separated that marriage bond, so I know that person's okay. I don't know whether the second person is okay, and I don't know whether that second person is a spiritual leader or not. If they come to me and they say, this is a faithful Christian, we're wanting to do this, then absolutely, biblically speaking, they're okay. But if they come to me and say, I'm hoping that I can convert him, I can't go for that. I mean, that's not worth risking your soul. Guys, there's nothing on this planet worth risking your soul. There are a lot of people who think that things like sex or money or power or fame is worth it. That's not worth your soul. All right, speaking of sex and power and fame, we now move to the 8 Day Old Circumcision. How about that for a lead-in? Genesis chapter 17, we have the first sign, guys. God says, from this point on, I want you to know you are a special people. And I want to be able to see that you are a special people. Here's how we're going to accomplish that. From this point on, any child that is 8 days old shall be circumcised. Why day 8?
When the prothrombin levels reach 120%.
Exactly. That, guys, day 8, as you read about in verse 12, that's the day when you have the most clotting factors available. Now, if you want to impress somebody with some scientific foreknowledge of the Bible, You open your Bible to Genesis 17, verse 12, and you ask them, how did this verse get in here? Because it took us years and years and years of study to learn that day 8 was actually the day that an infant has the most clotting factors available. And yet nobody, Abraham, none of his company from the ancient city of Ur of the Chaldees, none of them had ever been circumcised before this. This was a brand new sign of the covenant. So God makes this sign. We then have who come onto the scene in chapter 18?
Isaac.
Isaac. Look at starting in verse 11. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and somebody have a question? Question, comment? I thought I heard one of you talking. Okay. Verse 11. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. What does that mean?
She's too old to have babies.
Okay, but more specifically, what do we call that today?
Menopause.
Oh.
Menopause. Sarah had already gone through menopause, guys. You know, when ladies hit 40, 45 years old, what happens is they stop releasing eggs, their ovaries start literally shriveling up, they aren't producing hormones the way they used to, and it soon becomes physically impossible for them to have a child. Sarah had already reached that point. It had come and it had gone. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being all old also? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Notice verse 14, I love this. Is anything too hard for the Lord? So it's at that point that then, obviously, the child who would then take this lineage on to Jacob, take it on to Joseph, comes into the picture. Starting in verse 16 of that particular chapter, we've got something that everybody in the room has probably heard preached at least, I'd say at least a dozen times, where Abraham tries to intercede for Sodom. Somebody give me a modern day, very quick summary of what Abraham says.
If you find some righteous people in the land, will you spare the land?
Exactly. And he basically, it's kind of like dealing with a car dealer. Hey, if I can find 50, will you kill them for 50? Okay, what about 40? If I got 40, will you do it for 40? How about 20? If I can find 20 righteous people. Then he gets down to the number 10, verse 32. Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And God said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. What does that tell you about those cities? Guys, if you can't find 10 people, and realize it's not, we always say Sodom and Gomorrah. It also consisted of 2 other cities on the plain that we'll discuss a little more in detail. But you got Sodom and Gomorrah are the 2 main players in that region. You can't even find 10 people there. We hit chapter 19. And if you've never read chapter 19, you better make yourselves very, very familiar with it prior to a certain, shall we say, a certain time together where we're going to review some of this material. Chapter 19, guys, is one of the fundamental basic areas where Christians need to be familiar when somebody asks us about homosexuality. I'd love for somebody in the room who has not talked yet today to give me what are the homosexual activists, what would they say what's their argument in Genesis 19? Why did God punish Sodom? What was their actual crime?
Homosexuality.
But what do the homosexuals say it is? And again, you guys need to be aware of this and familiar with this. Yeah.
I've spoken, but I can go ahead and speak again if you want me to.
Now, front row, blue shirt. And what's your name? Yeah. Or light blue shirt. Yes.
Jordan.
Jordan. Okay, thanks, Jordan.
It would be, I think they said that they were inhospitable.
Inhospitable. Guys, that is the homosexual agenda's argument to Genesis chapter 19. As far as what's going on, why those people were there, why God rained down firestone, basically why he rained down fire and brimstone on the city. Basically, you all know most of the accounts, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I will point out Genesis 19, verse 5. They called to Lot, and they said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally." Homosexuals will say the reason why God destroyed the cities was not because these men were homosexual, it was because the people in the city were inhospitable. Now, how do we know that's no good? Again, guys, the best way to defend the truth is to let the truth speak for itself. We go to the New Testament, and we look, for instance, at, turn with me and look at Jude, verse 7. Somebody read me verse 7.
As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire.
Okay, so it specifically says in Jude verse 7 why God gave them up. Turn to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2. Somebody read me, starting in verse 5, read verses 5 and 6.
And spared not the old world, but saved Noah the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly.
Great. Okay. So does the New Testament tell us why God rained down Sodom and Gomorrah?
Very much so.
Absolutely it does, guys. So when I'm asked by a group of people in an open debate, whether it's an open forum or question and answer, and they say, what about homosexuality? What about the gay gene? What about XYZ? The first thing I try to do is I try to establish in their minds the fact that God doesn't change. His view on homosexuality hasn't changed in the patriarchal period, the Mosaic age, and the New Testament. And if God didn't approve of it in the patriarchal period, where we are right now, he didn't approve of it in the Mosaic or the New Testament, what do you think is his view today? The same. Very good. All right. So we pick up, starting, any questions, comments up to that point? No. Yes. Very good. Chapter 21, we've got Isaac being born. Verse 5 and 6. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. We then have Hagar and Ishmael departing the scene almost immediately after that. Chapter 22, we have Abraham's faith confirmed. Why is that a big deal? Yeah, in the back.
Without faith, it's impossible to please God.
Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Did God know enough about Abraham up to this point?
Yeah.
Yeah. But he still wanted to see how much this guy really believed in him. So here's what he does. He says, you know what, he actually had reconfirmed the fact, he says, I'm going to make your descendants like the stars and like the sands. Oh, and by the way, go get your son, we're going to sacrifice him. Now, I don't know, again, how many of you in there have children. I know a couple of you do. But I know as a dad, that would be a big pill for me to swallow. I've actually had this conversation with my children. You want to talk about an interesting conversation? Talk to them and say, yeah, boy, you know, if God tells me to kill you, I'm going to have to take you out. But guys, in all seriousness, you got to put yourself in the context of Abraham, what he has done, what he has gone through. He has left the comfort of Ur, where he knew. That's his hometown. You guys have left your hometowns. You are in a foreign city. You are studying like crazy. Now let's say you finally have that first child. The promised child. And God says, okay, I want him. It would be awfully hard at that point to do what you needed to do. Do you think Abraham knew what was going to happen?
No.
What do you think was going through his mind the whole way up there?
God has a plan.
God has a plan. So let's say that, for instance, in a week or two, you guys have got exam week. And it's rough and it's hard and you're thinking, man, what is going on? Why am I even here? Guys, God's got a plan. You may have wood strapped onto your back to go and build a fire, but he's got a plan. And eventually he's going to see you through that plan. What do you think was going through Isaac's mind?
This is cool. I'm with Dad.
Camping with Dad. JT.
Hebrews 11:19. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead.
Absolutely. There you go. So you got this man who had so much faith. He's willing to leave his home country, not even know where he's going to end up. And he's also willing, guys, to offer up his son because he knows the God he serves can do anything. Chris.
I think it also is teaching Isaac that Abraham doesn't put anything else before God, not even his own son.
Oh, I was going to hit that. Beautiful, beautiful. Guys, it's awfully tempting today, especially with what all's going on. And there's too many houses where children are running the show, or where children have a preeminence almost in many homes. Our children need to know, yes, they are special, yes, they are loved, but nothing comes before God. Nothing. Good point, Chris. Behind Chris, 2 rows back.
I was going to say, after showing this much faith, you have to wonder what reason he had to keep asking Sarah to be his sister. Maybe he liked being single.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I've heard it suggested several different places that Isaac was probably like 20 years old or something at this time. Is there any basis for that?
His age at this stage obviously is unknown, but I think on the timeline that I've got in my office, I've got him in his teens, probably early teens is what I've got. And I'll check on that for you. Over here on the left, is that Quentin?
Jonathan.
Okay.
What I've always noticed about the faith of Abraham is something that I carry over into my daily or in my evangelistic lifestyle, and that's when you're sacrificing somebody, sometimes it's more difficult when you realize that you're not sacrificing just your time with them, but if they're living a wrong life, you're sacrificing their soul when you have to let them go.
Yeah. It's a good point. Very good point. Yes, ma'am.
We can compare it to offering our children as a living sacrifice to God, and giving
Oh, yeah.
and giving them to God from their womb. They're going to live for Christ. I'm going to do everything I can to keep the devil away from them.
Yep. Guys, I don't know if any of you have experienced that moment. I hope that you all get the ability to. But as a Christian parent, there's usually a moment in your life where not only do you realize, hey, I'm responsible for keeping this child alive with food and keeping them clean and doing the things that physically taking care of them, but there's also a more humbling and a bigger point where you realize, oh, wow, that child has got a soul that's going to spend somewhere in eternity. And it is up to me to mold and to shape that child's soul. My wife and I, we take it exceptionally seriously. And, at this point, we're actually even more serious than we were when my first son was born. We don't regret the way we brought him up, but we do sit here now and we look back and we think, man, with what we're doing now, we kind of wish we'd started that 9 or 10 years ago. Because it is such a massively important thing that we want to make sure none of our kids gets left behind. I don't have to tell you, in a group like yourselves, there are too many preachers and preachers' kids who go off into the world. Don't let it happen to you. Don't let your children, while you're out there preaching and saving the world, don't let your kids be lost. Because if that's the case, then you failed at home. Great point about a living sacrifice. Up to this point, we read in the text where Abraham has basically been dwelling in tents. He dwells in a tent in Shechem. He dwells in a tent in Egypt. Where is the first place that we learn that he really, truly purchases land?
It'd be in chapter 23 when he bought land to bury Sarah.
That's right, guys. That's the first time that Abraham becomes what you and I might call a landowner. And again, I would point this out because this man, he views himself as such a servant of God that the whole land buying purchase, the whole land owning process has not been important to him up to that point. But now that his wife is dead, he's going to turn to the people at Machpelah. And he says, look, I want a cave. I want a place to be able to bury my dead. And that's where, in fact, he is able to bury Sarah. Chapter 24, we have an interesting occasion where Abraham is looking for a bride for Isaac. Look in verse 3. I'll make you swear by the Lord, the God of your heaven, the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but you should go to my country, to my family, and take a wife for my son Isaac. How many Christians in the church have lost their kids because they allow their kids to marry somebody who is, quote unquote, a Canaanite rather than a Christian? Now, make sure you understand what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you got to marry, that your children have to marry a Christian. I think it's very wise, and I think for my kids personally, we're going to have a list. And if you're not on that list, you don't even get selected.
Amen.
But in all seriousness, Abraham is playing a role in helping his son find a bride. He says, I don't want nobody from here, nobody in Canaan, because these people are descendants, ultimately, of Ham, and they're all basically pagans. I want you to go to my home country, and I want you to find somebody. So somebody give me in your own words what happens at that point. Servant goes there, and what does he find? Oh, come on. You guys surely know the account. Finding Rebecca at the well.
You want us to go into detail, like on the feeding drinking the camels and all that sort of stuff?
I want you to give it to me in your words. I want to be able to hear that you guys understand what's going on in the context.
Shut the microphone.
Well, the servant goes back, and you point to me.
Either one of you. There's two over here. Yeah.
You can go if you want to, but.
All right. The servant goes to the well. He asks God for the sign that the woman that's the right one for Isaac will water, not only won't give him water, but also draw for his camels. And Rebecca comes along. She's from Abraham's family, and she does that. So he knows that she's the right one for God. So he goes back to her and her family, and they're willing to let her go. So he takes her back to Abraham and Isaac.
Okay. Rebecca and Isaac are married. And again, what I want you to keep in mind as we're following through this is that lineage. God is using special people to keep this whole thing rolling along all the way from Adam to Christ. So we still have Abraham is still in the picture. He has bought a cave for his wife that is actually going to tie them to that land. He sends his servant off. His servant finds a wife, Rebecca. Isaac comes back. They get married. They have children. 2 children. Esau and Jacob. Everybody in here understands the major controversy with Esau and Jacob as far as their birthright. Somebody tell me in your own words what happened with the birthright.
Esau gave it up because he was hungry?
Yes, as some of you guys are looking at the clock for the break, just be thinking about that. What was the condition as far as firstborn children during that time?
They get the birthright.
Which is what? We say that word, but what does that really mean?
Inheritance.
All the inheritance or some of the inheritance?
All of them.
Commonly, they would get at least twofold over everybody else. Okay, so you got Esau. He is basically going to hit the jackpot. He comes in, he's hungry.
Was there expected obligations with that, though? I mean, it's not just a matter of getting the jackpot. These guys would be expected to look after or have a greater share of responsibility for the family line.
Absolutely, yeah. Because what if somebody, if things had gone normally, we got Esau and Jacob. Let's say Jacob died. What would Esau then have to do?
Take care of Jacob's family.
Care for Jacob's family. From that point on. Jared, that's a good point, in that from then on, it wasn't just hey, I got a title above my name. They had to make sure that family lineage moved into the next generation. So you got these two brothers. One of them tricks the other out of his birthright. But I think realistically the thing where it all comes down, we find in chapter 27 Isaac blessing Jacob. Who was instrumental in this part? The mom. Mom is instrumental because she helps him do what?
Trick his father.
Hairy arms.
She gives him hairy arms. Now, anybody in that room that has a hairy back, You got some other problems rather than your birthright. In all seriousness, guys, we got Isaac blessing Jacob. And it's in that they use basically all the major all the 5 senses. If you look in chapter 27, starting in verse 27, he came near, he kissed him, he smelled the smell of his clothing. He blessed him, saying, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field, which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren. Let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you. Blessed be those who bless you. Now, a blessing during those times was not just somebody saying a nice prayer to you. That blessing actually held significant, and in this case, a significant divine actions. And so from this point on, after these words are uttered by Isaac, Jacob's lineage is going to be one of the central casts from this point on. This also puts tension between Esau and Jacob, which we're going to catch up with a little bit later on. Comments or questions all the way through about chapter 28.
So they deceived, Jacob and Rebekah deceived his father. So that was
Absolutely they did.
Yet it was in God's plan for Jacob to, receive the greater inheritance. And
Yes. Can God use bad for good?
Yes.
Yes. Can God put leaders in place who are bad and use them for good?
Yes.
Yes.
Can.
Yes. Somebody else have a comment or question? Okay. We are going to pick up with Jacob meeting Rachel.
There's a question in the back.
I'm sorry.
Juanita has a question in the back, Brad.
I just mentioned, you said the 5 senses?
Yes.
Isaac couldn't see. That'd be one of the senses, wouldn't it? So what do you mean, the 5 senses? Touch, smell, taste?
Well, yeah, and in that, he could see, but he couldn't see well. The way that I've heard that described is, if you can imagine somebody old with really bad cataracts, so that you can basically see the form of somebody. If for instance, look in verse 20. Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? Talking specifically about the game. Verse 21, then Isaac said to Jacob, please come near that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son. So Jacob went near to his father. He felt him, the voice of Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau, he said. So you've got this man who basically is so old that many of his senses are starting to wear out and run down. But even though he can't see well, he can at least see somebody's form. He can at least see well enough to know that where it says, for instance, in verse 21, please come near, he knew he wasn't sitting beside him.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Other comments, questions?
Hey, did Isaac think he was about to die at that time? But he lived a long time after that, didn't he? 180 years was when he died.
Yep. So, which there again, that brings back the point that we were making on last Tuesday, a week ago. We talked about God gave them in Genesis chapter 6. He said, my days will not be long with you, 120 years. How do we know that that wasn't talking about the length of people's lives, there's your answer right there. Folks are still living older than 120 at this stage. Now, their lifespans have dramatically cut down. They're dramatically shaved off the 969 days of Methuselah. But we do have individuals who live past 120 at that stage. Okay, in order for us to get to Christ, what we've got to do at this stage is we've got to get the people down into Egypt, and we have got to grow this chosen Israelite nation. Because the reality of it is, all you got right now is a family. You've got one little family that's starting kind of to spring up and to grow. God's going to use that one little family, but He's got to grow a nation out of it. So in order to get that nation, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have a place where they can multiply. And He's going to do that in Egypt. Who is the character that gets us to Egypt?
Jacob?
Joseph. Joseph is going to carry the people to Egypt. Now, in order to do that, obviously, Jacob's going to have children. And he does. How many children does he have? 12, okay. From this point on in the account, all the way through the Pentateuch, guys, those 12 children are going to play a major, major, major importance. I don't expect you to stand up and sing the little song for me like my children do, but I do want you to be very familiar with the 12 children of Jacob. Because that's going to set the stage for the rest of this particular, Jared.
It's 12 sons but one daughter, so it's 13 children, 12 sons.
12 sons, I guess I should correct myself. Yeah. And again, guys, I don't ever mean to belittle ladies. Ladies play as much a role in this whole scheme as the guys do. But it's going to be the 12 sons of Jacob that we're following from this point on. Jacob, in order to have a child, he's got to be married. Who's he married? Yeah, Jared, go ahead.
It's really amazing that he had 12 sons. I mean, just imagine trying to flip a coin and arrive at 12 heads in a row. You can see God's providence working just through the size of the male contingent in that family.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you call that, and I don't want us to go way down this rabbit hole, but would you call that miraculous or providential?
Providential.
Yeah. Providential. In order for Jacob to have these 12 kids, he's got to be married. Mm-hmm. And we get thrown a curveball in this particular phase right here. Because he wants to marry who?
Rachel.
Who's he end up marrying? Leah. Now, guys, I don't know all of the customs back then. I do know, some of them. But I do know that if I woke up the next day and looked over and that wasn't my wife, I think I would have known that before then. But obviously at that stage they didn't. They were probably much more covered than we are today. There was a much more of a cultural environment in the giving of a daughter. So the Brad Harrub scenario is he approaches Rachel's dad. He says, that's fine, you can have my daughter, but what?
7 years.
You're going to work for me for 7 years. I want to see that you are worthy of my daughter, basically. But who is actually the oldest?
Leah.
Leah is. Why do you think Dad throws Leah at him?
We can get 7 more years of work out of him.
Firstly, it was a cultural expectation of the time that the oldest would be married first. But Laban he fooled him. He deceived him.
That is, okay. So you've got him saying, hey, work for me 7 years, I'll give you my daughter. He ends up giving him his oldest daughter. Guys, I think that's significant in that as a father, as a patriarch, he did not want to see his oldest daughter become an old maid. And so one way around that is to basically say, okay, here, I'm giving you my daughter's hand in marriage. He ends up giving the oldest daughter. Jacob wakes up and says, whoa, wait a second, that's not what I wanted. So he works an additional 7 years. Now, we have introduced into this picture right here multiple marriages. God allowed it, but did God approve of it? Keely.
We also have one of the first examples of a severely dysfunctional family, so I think that's really significant.
Very dysfunctional family. When somebody comes to you, though, and says, and guys, listen very carefully to this. When somebody comes to you from this point on and says, hey, you worship a God that allowed people to have dozens of wives, what is your response going to be?
Jesus teaches different later.
Okay. Behind Keely.
Well, there's a verse in Acts 17:30, in the times of this ignorance, God winked at.
Yes. Okay.
I actually had somebody ask me about this and say, why would God do that if he's such a righteous God or a just God? Well, it does say right after that he was very like with Abraham and Hagar. There was severe punishment, and he made a promise to Abraham that there's going to be a big struggle because he did this. So he allows it to happen, but he also promises consequences.
Okay. God allows a lot of things to happen, but that doesn't mean that that he approves of them. And by that, I oftentimes will try to use a modern day example. And I'll bring it home and say, hey, we live in a country where we're aborting roughly 5,400 unborn children every single day. God allows it, but do you think he approves of it? Absolutely not. There's no way that you can look me in the eye and say that God approves of abortion in the United States of America. But does he allow it to continue on? Absolutely he does. Same thing with marriage by people like Solomon or David, or in this case, we look at Jacob. Jacob had multiple wives. But that doesn't mean that God was smiling on Jacob saying, oh, I'm so glad you've got multiple wives. God was simply using that for his good in the end. So we've got a situation where Rachel is barren. And we know Leah was not barren. Who else has children for Jacob? Ah, look at y'all stretching. We will pick up right here in about 10 minutes, guys.